Well, as it turns out, he was not the only brother that had passed away. I had my youngest brother passed away in 2023 on Christmas Eve from
Wow.
complications of alcoholism.
I
And
can
one
only.
thing I noticed about my brothers is that
Hmm.
when they passed away, there really wasn't much of a trace left. I mean, when my brother passed away, he was already divorced from his wife. The brother passed away from ALS. So he was living in his house, but after he died, the house was liquidated, everything was sold off, and I realized it's like he disappeared. And and then there's my brother who died of alcoholism. He died at 53, left two kids behind, and and a wife and a house, but now he's not living it. He's not experiencing the joy of being with his children. So
Mm,
I think it just taught me that life is really precious, and I know we all hear that, but it really is.
yeah.
And it also taught me that if you're going to do something and you want to leave something of yourself behind, then you got to do it yourself.
Good morning, everyone. This is Unfiltered Conversations, and you with your host, Michael Rashad Yerby, and I'm with someone very, very special here. This is Joseph Bolton. Joseph Bolton is known for basically his historical storytelling and being an author that's building his public body of work with Old Grandmother Tree, a third volume, heavy illustration folk tale project rooted in the French Canadian ancestry of basically um, of books and lore. Publicly, he is not just about selling books. He is a man who's been in the military for 25 plus years, and he has a lot to say. Joseph, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it's great to be here today. Thank you.
Mm. It is amazing to have you here. Just doing our research about you from your official blogs to you being on show talking about you being a soldier to now you're writing different books, and that's very interesting. Just a quick overview, can you give our guests, who are you and what are you about?
Okay, well, I grew up in a French Canadian kind of environment and family in Rhode
Mhm.
Island with many other French Canadians back like in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And like many children, I was always very curious about my French Canadian heritage. I would ask questions of my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, great aunts and uncles. And, you know, for a long time, I was very curious about where we came from and what's the story. What goes beyond your great grandparents? You may know who your great grandparents are,
Yeah, yeah.
but back then, you'd be very lucky to know who your great great grandparents were. And most people would never know beyond that. So with the advent of new tools like Ancestry.com and Genie.com and the DNA test, I was able to piece the puzzle together. And I basically, on my mom's side, she's the French Canadian family, and we traced her ancestry throughout Quebec and into France. And also, I discovered through the DNA as well on Ancestry, I found four gateway Native American ancestors. And of those four, the most interesting was a Algonquin woman who lived in the mid 17th century in Trois-Rivières, Quebec. And her life, just as it turns out, was very well documented by the Jesuit priests, the French Jesuit priests who lived there in that time. And here's what we know about her. When she was 22 years old, she was living in this village, Algonquin village in Trois-Rivières, close to a French settlement. And she was married to another Algonquin named Assababish. They had two small children. And one night, the Mohawks from New York came up, raided her village. Her husband was killed, and her two small children were taken from her. So at
Mm,
22, she lost everything. She was barely out of her teens, and she lost her family,
mm,
her children. She never knew, for the rest of her life, she never knew what happened to them. No one knows. They just kind of disappear, but they're
oh,
gone. So 5 years later, she marries a French settler named Pierre Cauque, and Pierre and Rimete Wiawagwe, that's her name, they became my ancestors, and not just mine, but the ancestor of thousands of French Canadians in Canada and the United States. And she had, from a number of descendants she has a very wide reach of family. I mean, I've met descendants of hers in Pembroke, Ontario, throughout New England, into Quebec, right around here. It's amazing. So that's one of the most interesting part about her life. Those two facts right there. She lost her first husband and family at 22. 5 years later, she married a French settler, had a new family. And then, well, what else we know is at the end of her life, when she died in 1699, and she was 68 years old, the priest at Trois-Rivières, the Jesuit priest, he wrote about her. Rimete Wiawagwe lived a full life with dignity, respect, and love, a courageous and loving Algonquin woman. And I really struck me as I think that is the most beautifully written short eulogy I ever read about a person. And I think if any of us could have somebody stand up and just recite those two lines about our life at our own funeral, I think we could say that we lived very well. So between all those three events I just mentioned, there had to be a story. Especially, how do you go from barely out of your teens, you lose your family, and at the very end, a priest in Trois-Rivières, a French priest, makes note in his journal. He didn't just say, Rimete Wiawagwe, Algonquin woman, passed away. That's all he needed to say. But he put that comment in there for a reason.
Yeah.
And so she really had to have made an impression not only on him, but also on the people around her. And especially, you consider at that time, women didn't have much stature, status. And as a Native woman, she probably had even less. But yet she elevated herself through her dignity, respect, love, and courage. And so I think there's a great story there. And so I retold her story in these books. She's referred to in the book as Old Grandmother, and that's the title of the series, so it's named after her. Old Grandmother's Tree is a collection right now of 3 books, and I would say maybe 14 stories as it is right now, 14 interrelated stories, fully illustrated. I think right now we have probably 60,000 words of text and about 700 full color illustrations between the 3 books. So these are very beautifully drawn illustrations by the Toronto-based artist Natasha Pelly-Smith, with the assistance of Masami Kiono, who's our storyboard artist out of Manhattan. And so it's a big body of work. These aren't just small books, small stories or a collection. And what else makes it kind of interesting about these stories is that, there are people who have interesting ancestors and they would write historical fiction about them, right? That's common. People do that. And this is not historical fiction in that sense. What I did was I took Rimete Wiawagwe's story, her story, and the story of her descendants down to me, and I retold the stories through the language of a folktale, of folklore. So in these books, you have real historical people interacting with Native American inspired trickster animal characters. There's a little bit of magic. There's a little bit of, mystery and kind of the folklore elements. And so I chose that as a creative language because folktales are universal throughout the world. And when you read these stories, even though they're original, they will have a familiar feel to it because it's part of our universal language as people throughout the world. So how's that for a start?
That's excellent. So I guess my question up with you is like, when we talk about folklore and we're talking about basically presenting this story in this proper and true context, what are you trying to preserve? What are you trying to keep alive in the story? What are you trying to narrate to basically the listener and the reader in your books?
Well, I mean, I think the folklore format is something that needs to be a living format. People should write their own style folktales, and that's what I did. So it has a familiarity, but the stories are very original. They're not ancient stories like many folklore stories. But what I'm trying to preserve is the idea of that the story of our ancestors, their story did not end when they died and passed away, but we are the direct continuation of their story. So in a real sense, the way I look at it, if you are a descendant of Mrimatei and you read these books, you are in fact part of the story because you are a continuation of old grandmother's story. When she passed away, since you are a child of her, you are her story, and you are reading her story in a book written about her. It sounds very meta, metaphysical,
Yeah.
but I really do believe that you are the continuation story of your ancestors. And that's probably one of the big takeaways as far as what I want to preserve in these books.
One thing I'm hearing a lot is you're preserving that theme, especially when it comes to your ancestors, the story continuation, especially when I'm listening to you talking about your elders. What taught you that lesson before you wrote this this uh, this folklore down? What taught you to preserve those stories, and what made you want to?
Because I think I was always curious about these stories about our ancestors as a child, as I mentioned earlier.
Hmm.
So now what I've done is I've satisfied my curiosity with facts and information. But what I've done now is I've taken those facts and information about my ancestors' names and dates and places and maybe little tidbits of anecdotes about their lives. But now I resynthesized them into this old grandmother's tree book series.
Yeah.
So it's my way of expressing those connections I have with my ancestors.
You once said in previous interviews that if you can talk to your younger self, you'll talk to him and talk to him more about your grandparents, more about your
Mm.
relatives, while they were still here. And that is something that I cherish because one thing my parents really taught me growing up with older parents is that they said, always talk to your elders. And when an elder dies, like a library
Mm,
burning down
very
because
much.
because you don't have those stories anymore, and I found that so true, especially with my grandparents. So what questions do you wish you had or you could ask, sooner, before their passing?
I think I would have asked him, what do they think about Mrimatei Like my descendant through her goes through my mother's father.
Mhm,
And, I would love to share all this with him, and I would love to hear what he would think about it.
mhm,
Because, there was always a suspicion in our family that we did have Native American ancestry. And my grandfather, when he was younger, when he was a young man, like in his 20s, he looked very Native American. He had, an olive complexion, he had jet black hair, and it was just this persistent rumor. And I remember asking him one day, well, do we have it? And it was the only time in my life that I ever saw my grandfather upset. He said, no, absolutely not.
mm,
Turns out he did know, because I know that because his first cousin told me that they all knew, but he just didn't want to tell. Why? I don't know. But that
mm,
certainly is one thing I'd want to talk to him about. And I do believe, knowing him, that once he understood the story about her, I think he would have been very proud and very happy to have gotten to know her
mm,
through these books. And so that would be one question. And I think you just got to engage them and ask your elders about what stories did they, what do they remember as growing up? What was it like? And, what do you know about, do you have any stories about your grandparents?
mm,
Memory is a very tenuous thing, and it doesn't take very much for us to just disappear off the face of the earth without a trace.
yeah.
Maybe just even just a name. That's all that's left. And for most of my ancestors on ancestry.com, that's really all they are. I know nothing else about them except maybe where they were born and when they died and where they died and who they married and what children they have. But there's a lot more to their lives than that. So you really got to tap into that, because that's your only little window to the past is your elders.
So what kind of silence do you live with now because you didn't get a chance to ask your grandfather on your mother's side those questions and really to relay that information?
Well, and I
Yeah.
always wonder, like, why did he get upset? Why did
Mhm.
that? What was the one thing that I saw him really get upset? I mean, I seen him get frustrated,
Yeah.
uh, but he was a very gentle man, a very kind man. But why did that in particular, that question, what was the secret behind that? What happened to him? My own theory, and this is just a theory,
Mhm.
I do know that when he was in his 20s, about 1940 or so, he went to Wyoming for the Civilian Conservation Corps that was going on then under President Roosevelt. So he went to Casper, Wyoming in 1940. So remember, Wyoming at that time, the Wild West was still in living memory. There were people in 1940 who lived through that time. As we would say, we were children, cowboys and Indians.
Mhm.
And I often wonder if some people, some of those cowboys out there, took a look at my grandfather and made a judgment about him that
Mhm.
he found, rather unsettling. And I think
That
maybe he chose why to bury it at that time. That's
that
just a theory, but it's the only one that seems to fit what I saw of his reaction.
that makes sense. So take me back to, you know, that family, that world that you grew up in. What was the atmosphere like, before you had language, before it was given to you, before you was given that history? You know, you growing up in such a prominent community.
Well, I mean, there were a lot of people who were French Canadian. And even when I was a child, like in the late 60s and the 70s, older French Canadians in New England still could speak French. I know my
Mhm.
grandparents could speak French. They lost some of that fluency as they got older, but when they were raising their children, my mother and her siblings, they would often talk French to each other
Mm,
to know one way of trying to keep communication without the kids hearing it. And um, they kind of lost that as time went on, but they never encouraged my mother and her siblings to learn French. There was something that they felt pressure to assimilate. And it wasn't just them, it was many other French Canadians in that time period. It was like, well, we left Canada, we left Quebec, and now it's time to be American. And so we're going to be American. We'll mispronounce our names. We won't pronounce our last names as they should be pronounced in French. We'll anglicize them. We'll forget about French. Don't speak French. Encourage our kids not to speak French, and maybe we'll survive. And that was probably the attitude that prevailed at the time. But that was kind of dying out by the time I was growing up. So I always call it as I lived at the twilight of the golden age of French Canadian culture in New England. But now, it's been faded,
yeah,
not really suppressed, but kind of
that's
faded
it.
away. But it is starting to get a renaissance now. For example, in our town, I run a French Canadian festival, and in neighboring New Hampshire, they have a Poutine Fest, which is a big famous food in Quebec for those who are not aware of it. And so there is starting to get to be a renaissance. And oh, by the way, Canada just passed a law. It's Bill C3, Immigration Revision Law, and this is past December 15th, 2025.
Mhm.
And it says that if you have a Canadian citizen among your parent, grandparent, great grandparent, or great 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 grandparent, you are Canadian law, a Canadian citizen today,
Well,
right now. In order to kind of utilize that citizenship, you have to document it. And so you have to provide all the birth certificates from you all the way up to include your first, Canadian ancestor that you have.
hmm,
So that's something that a lot of people in New England, especially the French Canadian people like myself, we're looking to kind of reconnect to our ancestral land with that dual citizenship.
oh. So what did that place we come from and now it's getting kind of that renaissance mean to you as a kid growing up?
Well, I always had a sense of when I was a child and I see older relatives pass away, I would realize that I had cousins, third cousins that I really knew nothing about.
Yeah.
And I had a sense of that there was a world fading and there's information fading and connections are fading. And now, through this book and through Ancestry.com, I actually am able to make a lot of contacts
Yeah.
with people, extended part of the family and the community itself.
So did you know that memory was going to be your material as you gather all this stuff together?
Well, the first I owe a debt of gratitude to a man named Norman Lavalle. He
About it.
was an educator in Rhode Island, a
Mhm.
French teacher actually,
Mm.
and he's also a descendant of Mrimete Wiawagwe, and he's the one who actually did the research,
Oh,
combed through the records of the Jesuits, Jesuit records from Quebec, and pulled out this information about her life. And that's one of the reasons why we know so much about her. Not that the
oh,
information is destroyed, but unless you know where to look, it'd be very hard to find it. But he pulled it all together. And that became the inspiration for me to build on his information and create these stories. And
Mm,
when I first discovered my ancestry to Marie Merte Wiawagwe, she was he's the one that did the research. I discovered him at the same time, Norman Lavale. And sadly, by the time discovered him, I discovered his research, his website. He had passed away maybe a month or two prior to that, and he only lived about an hour away from where I'm at.
wow.
And so I'm always kind of sad that I didn't get a chance to meet him. He
Mm,
certainly was an inspiration, and if he was alive today, I'm sure he would have been absolutely delighted to see these books. Um, Sadly, one of his children deleted his website, and all that information is not found anymore on the web. But before that happened, I actually downloaded his web pages
okay,
and saved as PDF files.
smart.
And so I was able to save most of his work. And it's available on my website. And I have a section that says tribute, and you can see all the work for Norman Lavale did for really became the basis for this book, because I would have known about her losing her husband, first husband, and her children. I would have known about Asa Babish, her first husband, or a lot of other details about her life, or even what that priest wrote about her when she passed away. So I owe a lot to him. Um, it's a shame that I didn't get a chance to meet him. I think he would have liked the books.
Wow. So it's safe to say that growing up in a French Canadian community, basically seemed like a tight knit community, kind of shaped you in your life.
Mhm. I think so, because there
Yeah.
were a lot of kids that were French Canadian. So, excuse me, there was always this like sense of connection and community, and people didn't when they grew up, they kind of lived right there in the community.
Uh-huh.
But with my mother's generation, a lot of them kind of scattered to the four winds throughout the United States.
Yeah.
So, it was probably that was the thing that I saw fade away, was that closer knit community that I remember as a child.
And coming from a community like that, going into the military, we was kind of discussing it, and you was just basically letting me know you joined the military, you volunteer for airborne, you and from there
Hmm.
you was able to go to West Point. I think you said Ranger School, and then Afghanistan, right? Um,
Yes. Yep.
which is a part of your, your thriving in life in that world, right? So what part of you had to go quiet to survive something like that? When, coming from that background, you're not able to express yourself. You have to, accommodate to the rules of the military. And I would say for myself, I always feel like growing up in Miami, I had to suppress certain things about
Hmm.
myself so I can, I guess, fall in line to the rule of
Hmm.
military culture. So how
Right.
did that affect you?
Um, I think the military culture, some ways, nothing against the military culture. I would never change military culture. It works for what it has to do. But
Yeah,
in some ways, I think my creativity and my imagination didn't really fit in with that
uh,
military culture. So there really wasn't an outlet for me to express that creative side of myself in the military. And that's why I really didn't really start writing until probably like 8 years after I retired.
so how did the Army sharpen you in that regards when it comes to writing and expressing yourself?
I would say, my education at West Point teaches you a lot about clarity in your writing,
Yeah.
grammar. That was always very important. Being able to write in multiple different styles. I had a writing class. It was a grammar and writing. And in that class, sometimes the professor would give us a book to read, and then we had to write in the style of that book's author. So that was kind
Mm,
of an interesting aspect. So I think that those things have helped me eventually as a writer,
yeah.
because it gave me, the ability to write clearly, think clearly, and also to change voices and perspectives easy enough as well.
And when you look back now, especially you're retired 25 years in, and you talk about the military gave you that, I
Hmm.
guess, that clarity, especially when it comes to writing, understanding syntax and everything of that nature. Where did your, I guess, your imagination, your sensitivity, your story driven self life come into play during those military years? Like you said, it took you eight
Not,
years after the
yeah,
military. Like,
yeah. No, actually, I really didn't really start writing creativity. I did it some as a child, and when I was a
Mhm,
teenager and into college, I wrote poetry. I didn't really write short stories. Um, and later on, though,
mhm,
the first thing that really got me writing was when my brother, younger brother, died in 2013 of ALS. He
Sorry,
was
my
also in the
condolences.
Army. Thank you. He was in the Army. He was working in the Pentagon. He was a lieutenant colonel, and he had, once he was first diagnosed, he had problems for a while. And
Mm,
the way the military always treats when you have like a pain in your leg, initially from PT, what do they give you? Motrin, right? Because the military always treats, their first philosophy is to treat symptoms rather than diagnose.
yep.
And then when they treat symptoms and it doesn't work, then they'll do diagnosis of what you have. Well, anyway, it turned out my brother had ALS. He died in 2013. And, that left, I turned to writing a blog called Augustine's Alley.
Mm,
And I did that just as a way as an outlet for myself. I would write on science, philosophy, religion, mathematics, family history, whatever I wanted to. Towards the end of when I was really active on that website, I wrote this short story about a Greek fable, kind of my interpretation, what we call like fan fiction of a Greek fable.
mhm.
Um, and so that was kind of the start of my creative process. And when I started taking French, I wrote a short story in French for my teacher. And that short story, Le Trope de Sabot, became the first story I wrote for all the Old Grandmother's Tree, a book series, actually.
So, man, I would like to explore that a little bit. Like, so when your brother passed away, and you said you started writing different things, as you're still in the military at that time, you
No,
still have
I
a
actually was
wife.
out. No, I was out.
Oh, you was already out. Okay.
I was out, but I was
So,
working as a contractor.
oh, okay. So what became urgent after that time? What stopped mattering? What started mattering? How did you define your grief to actually pivot to where you pivot to?
Well, as it turns out, he was not the only brother that had passed away. I had my youngest brother passed away in 2023 on
Mm,
Christmas Eve from
wow.
complications to alcoholism.
My
And one thing I
condolences.
noticed about my brothers is that
Mhm,
when they passed away, there really wasn't much of a trace left. I mean, when my brother passed away, he was already divorced from his wife. The brother passed away from ALS. So he was living in his house, but after he died, the house was liquidated, everything was sold off. And, I realized it's like he disappeared. And
mm,
and then there's my brother who died of alcoholism. He died at 53, left two kids behind, and and a wife and a house, but now he's not living in it. He's not experiencing the joy of being with his children. So
mm,
I think it just taught me that life is really precious, and I know we all
mm,
hear that, but it really is.
yeah.
And it also taught me that if you're going to do something and you want to leave something of yourself behind, then you got to do it yourself. And as it turns out, I also look at these books as my way of leaving my mark that people will talk about me for
Mhm,
years after I'm gone. That hopefully they'll remember me for these books. So it's
mm.
my message to the future. And I
So
think that's
question
part of what you want to do. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, 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 sorry, sorry. It's just very interesting that you made me it's like you just give me so many questions. It's just like,
Keep
because
asking. Keep asking. I'd
yeah,
love to.
because
I'll field them.
yeah, because it's like amazing. Like you have situations that happen in your life, right, that are very traumatic, and it forced you to bring something out of yourself, right, and it forced you to recognize certain things in your life. And then you talk about, like your research. And I mean, of course, you got a lot of research from other people, right, on the backs of individual. That's how we grow off
Hmm.
the work of individuals.
Right.
But I would ask you, like, and you talk so passionately about it, what happened inside your ancestry research that stopped being more, I guess, stopped being like interesting information and started becoming like a personal revelation through your connection to your ancestors? Because like you said,
Mm.
you just you was just curious, but now it's like, oh my God, it's like personal revelation for you.
Well, once I wrote Le Trope de Sabot, and that is a little story that starts off in 1901 Quebec, and it's about farm animals escaping the barn at midnight to go tobogganing down the hill in Quebec. And it turns out the farm was owned by my great great grandparents. of whom the grandmother is the one that is descended from the old grandmother. So that's how that connection became the genesis of the story. And
Mhm.
originally, Rimete Wagwe was going to be just a little side story of the background of the main story, which is in 1901 Quebec with my great-great-grandmother and her husband and their family. But I soon realized that actually the story was my old grandmother, Rimete Wagwe,
Yeah.
based on how fascinating her life was. And so it kind of shifted after I wrote that first story, and she became the trunk of the tree
Mm.
that ties in all these books together. And so as I started creating these stories and I started working with the artist to create her image, I felt very much inspired that we were actually really showing the world who she was. We felt,
Mm.
both myself and the artist felt like we were inspired to show her and write about her in a certain way. And the artists were inspired to demonstrate who she was. A person kind of emerged from that. Even to this day, I was just reading the next book in the series that has not been published yet, but it's
Oh,
in draft. I'll show you the cover. If you can see it there.
yeah.
You see it? All right.
Can't find
Yeah.
it like yet.
Yep. It's called Campfires in the Sky, but it's going to be about the end of her life.
Oh.
She's gonna retell the story of the attack to her French Algonquin granddaughter. But she became kind of the inspiration for the book, and her as a person started to emerge in my mind. And one
Mhm.
of the first ways that did, this is kind of an unusual story. I was looking at a picture of my great grandmother on her wedding picture of my great grandmother, and she's my grandfather's mother, so she is also a descendant of Rimete Wagwe, my great
Mhm.
grandmother. This woman is Zala, and in her picture, she was wearing a small cross necklace with a small cross on it. And when I was looking at that picture of my great grandmother, and we were doing early designs of Rimete Wagwe, I heard a little voice say, "I want you to draw me with a cross like that as well," because that was part of who she
Mhm.
was. And so that's what we did. I felt kind of inspired. So when you look at her pictures of her, you'll see that she's wearing a small little cross, just like right
Yeah.
here, right there. I think also physically, I think we captured her look. I really believe that. We'll never really know.
Mhm.
I think that she was a little bit more on the shorter stature side. I think that she liked to carve wood into
Yeah.
like little animal figures. I think that she liked to do that. She was very resilient because she survived tragedy in her life. Not only did she lose her first two children with her first husband lose her first husband, but she also lost her eldest daughter when she was 17, the eldest daughter that she had with Pierre Cauc, the French settler that she married. So there's this woman that was very resilient. So I think we captured her physical look, her personality. I think it really comes through, and we're kind of inspired to show who she was. And I think that's one of the journeys that I've been on as this has developed.
It's pretty amazing. You said, in previous podcasts that you were part of that these stories come to you like movies in your mind. You don't
Yes,
really
yes,
kind of
that's
like
true.
you don't really kind of work on them. You're like from like a strict outlook. So what does trust look like in that process, especially with your artists that you commission to do the illustrations, and then also with you writing?
Well, I think the story process begins with I see the story in my mind as a movie. It kind of plays through. And with that, I kind of take the characters of the book and put them in the setting and I watch what they do. And this is all playing in my mind. I don't tell the characters what to do. And I think there's other writers will tell you the
Mhm.
same thing. Characters have a
Yeah,
life of their own within yourself.
yeah.
And so after a while, watching this movie play out, I finally feel it's ready. I sit
Mhm.
in front of the computer and I type it out. I don't do one of these. I'm not one of these writers who says, okay, I got to type 1,000 words today,
Yeah.
or I got to do this outline. I never did any outlines for any of the stories. I would just write them from the top of my head. I'll get a solid draft, almost sometimes on the first sitting, and then kind of revise it from there. Once the revisions are done enough where I'm satisfied, I think we got a pretty good direction of where the story is going. I
Mhm.
would hand the story over to Masami Kiyono, who's our storyboard artist. So she would do those rough sketches, very good rough sketches, but they were like, they're not colorized.
Yeah.
And we'd work together to kind of map out where each illustration would go in the story. We
Okay.
talk about every illustration, like what should be in this illustration. And Masami sometimes would come up with ideas of her own that should go in, an
Mm.
illustration. So she's had a lot of influence in that. So once the rough sketches are done, overlaid into the draft story,
Yeah.
then I would do two things. Number one, I'm handing the story over to the editor for revisions, the
Yeah.
text, but I'm also handing it over to Natasha Pelly-Smith, who's our final illustrative artist. She actually creates original illustrations from those rough sketches. And she also adds her own layer of creativity and lighting and style on top of those rough sketches.
Yeah.
So that's how that whole process works. And yet it is kind of involved, and because there's a lot of going back and forth. There's a lot of Zoom calls I have to have with the artist. We talk about what direction we're going. Sometimes we realize we have to make changes. Sometimes I'll make changes in the text based on the direction the illustration went. I'll look at it
Mhm.
and say, yeah, it's a really good illustration. It wasn't what I was originally looking for, but we'll go with it, and I'll just change the text to make it kind of match up.
So how does that work, especially with the trust process? And you just expressed with the next folklore book that you have, when the story kind of goes dark.
What do you mean the story goes dark? When
Like when it starts to you're talking about the time where she's going through unrivaled pain.
Oh,
F
I see.
you know
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in that story, this one right here,
Yeah.
the first three books don't talk directly about the attack that, where she lost her family. But in this one,
Yeah.
when she's just before she dies, as an old woman, she tells the story to her granddaughter.
Oh, okay.
And I think if I may open up, I'll read. So that's a good point I would make, is that these stories have a lot of different feels for them. Some are kind of farcical because you have trickster animal characters in them.
Mhm.
Some are thoughtful, and some have a little bit more of a darker theme to it. Not gratuitously, but because that's the time that they're talking about.
Yeah, it's life.
And I'm going to look back here, and what I'm going to do is going to open up to the section where Rimete Wiawagwe discovers that her children is gone. So before this happened, what it was is that she was with her children in her home. Her husband went to defend the village. Her sister runs in, her sister Kahenta, and tells her, "Hey, Rimete Wiawagwe, you've got to leave. You've got to go to Asababa. He's hurt." And Rimete Wiawagwe goes, "Well, what about my children?" And her sister says, "I'll stay with them." And so her sister
Mm.
stays with them. She gets to her husband. Her husband has died just before she got there. And then she says, "The children," and she runs back to the house. And so this is what she finds. This is what happens when she goes in there. She sees that it's empty. And I'm going to read this to you. And this is kind of like the series. I don't know how well you can see the illustrations that go with it. There's her
Mhm.
looking at the empty house. There's her remembering, saying, "Hey, I got to get back to my children."
Yeah.
So this is what she's saying. She's narrating this to her granddaughter. "As I stood there in shock, I remembered my children and I ran back to my house. When I got there, they were gone, along with
Mm.
Kahenta." Rimete Wiawagwe looked out the window. "At that moment, I realized that I'd lost everything. My children, my husband,
Mhm.
and my sister." Let me just turn
Mm.
the page here.
Mm.
Mitio
Oh,
Goku Rimete Wiawagwe turned back to Marguerite. "There was so much emotion within me, without any outlet or way to express how I felt. I collapsed to the floor and just stared into the dim emptiness in front of me. I don't know how I could understand." Marguerite gently wiped a tear from her grandmother's cheek. "Pray that you never do, my dear one." Mitio Goku gently placed both of her hands on Marguerite's cheek. "I was only a little bit older than you are now, and up until that moment, I was a naive and innocent girl who knew nothing of violence and war." Rimete Wiawagwe looked deep into her granddaughter Marguerite's eyes. "That innocent girl, that girl that was me, died on the floor of that empty longhouse, and I have mourned for her for the rest of my life." And so that's
mm.
a little passage from that. So
Yeah.
these stories they're not even though they're fully illustrated with beautiful
Yeah.
color illustrations, some stories are kind of funny and humorous. They're not all have the same tone.
Yeah.
But that event, that part of the story has to be told because it's the catalyst that drives all the rest of the changes of that story. It propels her life in a different direction. So they're stories that adults really enjoy. They're stories that they can read to their children. And I think, 10-year-olds, we find hearing that story being read to them by their parents kind of explained, or even younger. But there are elements of that it's not like a little kid's book at all. Some people say, oh, it's a kid's book. Well, not exactly.
Yeah, not exactly.
Most it's the adults that read them. So anyway, I just want to share that with that story. That book has not been published yet. It's going to come out next year because it takes time to get the illustrations
Yeah.
done.
And see, I love stories like that. That's the realism. C.S. Lewis said something very, very pivotal back in the day. He was like, a child story that only captures the imagination of children. Of course, I'm saying this in context,
Mm-hmm.
is a terrible story. A story should captivate adults as well, right?
Right.
So I love that where you can tell that has so much realism because people go through great loss in their life at any
Mm-hmm.
different at any age. You can't control what life brings to you. And it brings me to my final question to you is like,
Okay.
where do you personally draw the line between honoring the past, especially with the research you have, and also inventing the storyline and taking it to a different place, especially when you have so many people in the writing and the imagination process?
Um, I really don't have a hard line
Okay.
in there. Um, I use the facts, as a basis for the story
Hmm.
of the character's life in this tape, old grandmother and her other descendants. But there isn't a hard line as well. I didn't, well, we're not going to go there. We're going to go ahead and keep the stories original and we'll be
Yeah.
imaginative. So, and I use those very imaginative folklore elements to really shine a spotlight inside the characters so you understand what their motivations are and what they're thinking and what they're feeling. So there really
Mm.
isn't like a hard line.
Got you. Well, thank you so much, Joseph, for being on the show. I really and truly, truly appreciate all that you do and all that you are, for the thoughtful, honest conversation, full of care, for the people in your life that actually defined who you are. I'm so grateful for your time, and I'm grateful and more grateful for the way you reminded us that our memory and holding that memory of our ancestors means so much because especially through folklore and then writing these stories, you carry that piece and you carry that history forward
Mhm.
throughout your generation. So appreciate you and thank you. So if anything else you have, the floor is yours.
Okay. First of all, I want to say is that if you want to find these books, I would encourage you to visit my website, which is oldgrandmotherstree.com, and there's no apostrophe in there. Oldgrandmotherstree.com, written as one word. In there, you'll find a biography of myself, also Natasha Pelly Smith. You'll find the Norman LaValle tribute page, which is his old website that I captured, and a lot of good information there, background information. And I also have a character Wikipedia with over 100 entries in there. So it's pretty detailed. So if you're curious to get a feel for how the story flows, I would encourage you to go ahead and visit the character Wikipedia. I think you'll find it very interesting. And the other aspect I would say about these stories, there's 3 volumes, but the stories are written in a way that each story can be read on its own without having to read the stories in any kind of order. They stand
Mhm.
on their own. So you can begin with any volume and you can begin with any story within a volume. Um, but wherever you start in the series, every story you read becomes a piece of the mosaic that you're putting on the wall, and a much grander picture will emerge. And it doesn't matter what order you read the stories, that will kind of come out. And the last thing I would say, I always make a plug for this, is I really do believe this story is meant to be seen visually in a visual meeting into like maybe a short Netflix or Apple TV TV show or maybe
Mhm.
a movie. So I'm always hoping somebody out there, the right person, is going to hear me and is going to take interest in these books, because it's all ready to go. You think about it, there's almost one illustration per page. So the story itself has been storyboarded for you, Mr. Filmmaker, Mr. Animation Studio. So this is ready to go. It's very entertaining. It's has a positive message without being overly heavy-handed about it. And it's funny, it's thoughtful, it's it's family, and it's positive, but it's above all else, it's entertaining, it's ready to go. So, Mr. Producer, Mr. TV producer, you reach out to me and we're going to get this going. I do believe it's going to happen eventually, because it's that good, if I say so myself.
And I do agree. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you. And everyone, please go to his website, read the Folklore stories. It is amazing. And like you said, it stands on its own. Wonderful. So appreciate your time. All right, guys. Love you.
All right.
Peace.
Goodbye.